Eli Marsh had been 13 minutes into fixing the vent regulator in Corridor 9 when the alarm started, and his first thought, before fear, before anything else, was that someone was finally going to notice what he could do. He didn't want them to notice. He'd spent 2 years making sure they wouldn't. The colony called itself Havern Processing Station 7, though nobody who lived there called it that. The humans who worked its lower levels called it, simply, the Pit, a sprawling underground labor facility on a Krell mining world, built to process ore extracted from the planet's crust, and incidentally, to house the several thousand human laborers, whose ancestors had been resettled there 3 generations earlier under a labor agreement most of them had never seen and none of them had signed. Eli had been born in the Pit. He had never seen open sky. He knew the sound every machine in the lower levels made when it was working correctly, and he knew, with more precision than any of the colony's actual technicians, the specific, subtle sound each one made in the hours before it started to fail. He was 12 years old, and he was, by every official designation the Krell administration kept on file, an unskilled juvenile laborer assigned to basic cleaning and waste transport duties. Nothing in his file mentioned that he had, over the past 2 years, quietly repaired 11 pieces of critical infrastructure that certified adult technicians had either misdiagnosed or given up on entirely. He liked it that way. Being invisible meant being left alone. Being left alone meant being able to work. He'd gotten to the vent regulator that morning because he'd noticed, 3 days earlier, a faint irregular clicking in the airflow through Corridor 9 that nobody else seemed to register. He traced it over 2 lunch breaks and 1 very carefully timed absence from his cleaning shift to a worn bearing housing deep inside the regulator assembly, the kind of failure that wouldn't register on the colony's automated diagnostics for another 2 weeks, by which point the regulator would have seized entirely, and Corridor 9's ventilation would have gone dark for however long it took an overworked, understaffed maintenance crew to notice, diagnose, and requisition a replacement part. He was 13 minutes into a repair that should have taken him 20 when the entire facility's alarm system erupted around him, red emergency lighting flooding the corridor, a deep, station-wide klaxon that Eli had only ever heard twice before in his life. Central atmospheric failure. He froze, one hand still inside the regulator housing, and understood immediately that this was not the kind of problem he could quietly disappear from. Foreman Grissom found him 10 minutes later, exactly where Eli had known he'd be looked for eventually, crouched in the maintenance access behind Corridor 9's regulator, toolkit spread carefully around him, the panel he'd been repairing now sealed back into place as though he'd never touched it. "Boy," Grissom said, out of breath from the climb down. He was an older man, gray-haired and heavyset, with the permanently tired look of someone who had spent 30 years managing an impossible job with impossible resources. Central processors failing, whole colony. "You feel that?" Eli had felt it, a subtle change in the pressure of the air around him, the kind of thing his ears had learned to notice years before he'd had words for it. "Air's getting thin," Eli said quietly. "Air's getting thin," Grissom agreed grimly. "Krell engineers have had their hands in that processor for 2 hours, and it's getting worse, not better. Overseer Vantik's about ready to evacuate the lower levels to Sector 8, and Sector 8 doesn't have capacity for 6,000 extra people, not without killing half of them through overcrowding and rationing failures inside a week." "Why are you telling me?" Eli asked, though he already suspected the answer, and it made something cold settle in his stomach. Grissom crouched down slowly, joints protesting, until he was at eye level with the boy. "Because 2 years ago," he said quietly, "the water reclamation unit in Sector 4 failed, and every certified technician on the station said it would take 11 days to fix minimum, while 600 people rationed drinking water down to almost nothing. And it got fixed in 6 hours instead. And I never said anything, because you looked at me the day after with an expression that told me exactly how much you didn't want anyone to know it was you." Eli said nothing. "I've watched you for 2 years, boy," Grissom said, "the heat exchanger in Sector 2, the waste processor motor last winter. 11 things by my count that you fixed quiet and let someone else take credit for, or let stand unexplained because you didn't want the attention." He paused. "I never told anyone. I figured it was your business how you wanted to live. But right now there's a processor failing that's going to kill people if it's not fixed inside the next few hours, and I can't in good conscience keep your secret if keeping it costs lives." Eli looked down at his tool kit, a collection of scavenged parts and improvised instruments he'd built over years of quietly disassembling broken things nobody wanted. learning by feel and failure what none of the colony's actual training programs had ever offered a 12-year-old considered too young and too unskilled for anything beyond cleaning duty. "They won't listen to me," he said quietly. "I'm a kid. I'm not licensed. I'm not even supposed to be in the maintenance corridors without supervision." "I know," Grissom said. "I'm going to make them listen anyway, but I need you to be ready to prove it, because Overseer Vantik isn't going to take my word for it. He's going to need to see." Overseer Vantik was, by the standards of Krell Colony Administration, a reasonably fair man, which was to say he followed regulations precisely, treated the humans under his authority with the cold correctness of someone managing valuable equipment rather than people, and had never once, in 11 years running Havern Station 7, considered that any of his human laborers might possess skills beyond what their assigned designations indicated. He was standing in the central control room, 4 Krell engineers arrayed around a holographic schematic of the atmospheric processor, all of them arguing in increasingly tense tones about a failure mode none of their diagnostic protocols could fully explain, when Grissom pushed his way into the room with a human child in tow. "Foreman," Vantik said, his patience audibly thinning, "this is not the time." "With respect, Overseer, this is exactly the time," Grissom said. "This is Eli Marsh. He's fixed 11 pieces of critical infrastructure on this station over the past 2 years that your certified technicians either misdiagnosed or declared unfixable. I believe he can help with the processor." Technician Azu, the senior Krell engineer overseeing the processor diagnostics, made a sound that in his species passed for a derisive laugh. A human child. A human child who has spent his entire life inside this facility, learning how every machine in it sounds when it's working and when it's about to fail, Grissom said. "I understand how that sounds, technician. I'm asking you to set aside how it sounds and consider that you've had 4 senior engineers working this problem for 2 hours with no progress, and the air in the lower levels is getting worse, not better." Vantik studied Eli for a long moment, a thin, quiet boy in worn work clothes, standing very still, clearly uncomfortable with the sudden attention but not looking away. "How old are you?" Vantik asked. 12, Eli said. "And you believe you can diagnose a failure my senior engineering staff cannot?" Eli hesitated. 2 years of careful invisibility told him to say no, to shrink back, to let the adults handle it the way adults were supposed to. But he thought about the pressure change he'd felt in the corridor, about what thin air did to the youngest children in the lower levels, about his own sister Nadia 3 levels down doing rationed labor shifts in air that was, he was fairly certain, already getting harder to breathe. "I don't know if I can fix it," Eli said honestly. "But I know your engineers have been looking at the wrong part of the system for 2 hours, because I can hear it from here, and it's not what's on your diagram." The room went quiet. "Explain," Azu said, his earlier dismissiveness replaced by something sharper, more attentive. Eli looked at the holographic schematic floating above the console, a detailed cross-section of the atmospheric processor's primary systems, red warning indicators scattered across the compression stage and filtration arrays. "Your diagnostics are all showing failure in the compression stage," Eli said. "That's what's throwing all your warnings, but compression failures sound different. They're loud, they're mechanical, you can hear the strain in the motor housing from 2 corridors away. I've heard that sound before, when the Sector 4 compressor started going bad 3 years back. This isn't that sound." "Then what is it?" Vantik asked, despite himself leaning forward slightly. "It's quieter," Eli said, "higher pitched. It's coming from somewhere behind the compression stage, not inside it. I think it's in the pressure regulation feed, the part that controls how much processed air gets released back into circulation versus recycled back through filtration. If that regulator's stuck or partially blocked, it'd make your compression stage work harder to compensate, which would throw exactly the kind of warnings you're seeing on that diagram, but the actual problem wouldn't be the compressor at all. It'd be upstream of it, somewhere your diagnostics aren't even looking." Azu stared at the boy for a long moment, then turned sharply to his own console, pulling up a secondary schematic that had, until that moment, registered no warnings at all. "The pressure regulation feed," he murmured, more to himself than anyone else, tracing lines across the display. "It would not generate a compression stage warning pattern under standard diagnostic parameters, but if the blockage were partial rather than complete." He trailed off, running rapid calculations, and Eli watched something shift in the engineer's expression, skepticism giving way slowly to genuine attention. It is possible, Azu admitted finally, sounding almost offended by his own conclusion. Improbable given standard failure patterns, but possible. How would you even know to listen for that? Vantik asked Eli, something in his tone shifting from irritation to genuine curiosity. None of our engineers are trained to diagnose by sound alone. Eli shrugged, uncomfortable under the sudden attention. Nobody taught me anything, he said. I just listen all the time since I was little. There's not much else to do down here, and machines make noise, and if you pay attention long enough you start to notice when the noise changes before anything actually breaks. I've been wrong before. But I don't think I'm wrong about this. The pressure regulation feed was located in a narrow maintenance crawl space deep behind the processor's main housing, a space so tight that none of the Krell engineers, built broader and taller than the average human, could physically fit inside it without partially disassembling the surrounding structure first, a process that would take hours the colony didn't have. Eli could fit, barely, but he could fit. Absolutely not, Nadia Marsh said, the moment she arrived in the control room, having been pulled from her shift by a nervous junior technician sent to fetch her. She was 17, tall and sharp-eyed, and she positioned herself immediately between her younger brother and the assembled Krell officials with the particular ferocity of an older sister who had spent years protecting a boy too young to protect himself. He's 12. You are not sending a 12-year-old into a live industrial system that's already failing. Nadia, Eli started. No, she said, not looking away from Vantik. I don't care how smart he is. I don't care what he's fixed before. He is a child, and you people have never once cared about that fact until it became useful to you. Vantik met her gaze steadily, and to his credit, didn't flinch from the accusation. You are right to be angry, he said, which surprised everyone in the room, including himself. This colony has never adequately accounted for what your brother is capable of, and that failure is entirely the administration's, not his. I cannot undo 11 years of oversight in the next 10 minutes, but I can tell you honestly that if this processor is not repaired within approximately 3 hours, atmospheric pressure in the lower levels will drop below safe thresholds for children, the elderly, and anyone with respiratory vulnerability. Your brother may be the only person on this station capable of accurately diagnosing the failure in time to prevent that. Nadia's jaw tightened. She looked at Eli, really looked at him, the way Grissom had described looking at him 2 years earlier, and saw the same quiet, stubborn resolve she'd seen in him since he was small enough to fit inside the ductwork. He was now the only one capable of navigating. I'm going with him, she said, all the way to the crawlspace entrance, and someone is going to have a rescue line ready to pull him out the second anything goes wrong. Agreed, Vantik said, without hesitation. The crawlspace behind the atmospheric processor was dark, narrow, and hot from residual heat off the failing machinery, and Eli moved through it the way he moved through every tight, forgotten space in the colony, carefully, methodically, one hand always checking the surface ahead before he committed his weight to it. He could hear the sound clearly now, the high, irregular whine he'd noticed from 3 corridors away, growing louder as he approached the pressure regulation assembly. It was exactly where he'd expected it to be, a compact mechanism nestled behind the main compressor housing, its casing warm to the touch, the whine coming from somewhere deep inside its regulatory valve. Talk to me, Eli, came Nadia's voice through the comm unit clipped to his collar, tight with barely restrained worry. What are you seeing? Valve stuck, Eli said, working his small flashlight into the gap between the housing and the wall to get a better angle. Not fully closed, not fully open. There's something jammed in the mechanism, looks like debris, maybe ore dust that got past the primary filtration and worked its way in here over time. He worked carefully, patiently, the way he'd learned to work on every stubborn piece of machinery that had ever taught him something. It's not a design failure, it's just old. Nobody's cleaned this regulator in a long time, because nobody knew it needed cleaning, because it's buried back here where nobody ever looks. Can you fix it? Vantik's voice this time, relayed through the comm from the control room. I think so, Eli said. I need to clear the jam without damaging the valve seal, or the whole assembly's going to need replacing, and I don't think you have a spare on this station. We do not, Azu confirmed grimly. Eli worked in careful silence for several minutes, using a thin improvised tool from his kit, a length of flexible wire he'd shaped and reshaped a dozen times over the years for exactly this kind of delicate work, to slowly, patiently clear the accumulated debris from around the valve mechanism without forcing it, without rushing, the way he'd learned through years of trial and painful error that machines needed to be handled. There, he said finally, feeling the valve give slightly under gentle pressure, moving freely for the first time in what he suspected had been months, maybe longer. That's it. That's the blockage. He worked the valve through its full range of motion twice, confirming smooth operation, then carefully sealed the access panel back into place, exactly the way he always did, leaving no obvious trace, out of 2 years of habit, before catching himself and realizing, this time it didn't matter if anyone knew. Regulators clear, he reported. It should start compensating properly within a few minutes, once the pressure feed evens back out. The compression stage should stop overworking once it's not fighting a partial blockage anymore. There was a tense silence on the comm channel, stretching for nearly 2 full minutes, before Azu's voice came through, tight with something that sounded almost like disbelief. Compression stage load is dropping, the engineer reported. Pressure regulation is stabilizing. Atmospheric output is returning to nominal parameters. A pause. It is working. Eli felt something in his chest loosen that he hadn't fully realized was clenched tight. He emerged from the crawlspace 40 minutes later, dust-streaked and exhausted, to find the control room crowded with people who had, until that morning, never had a reason to know his name. Nadia pulled him into a fierce hug the moment he cleared the access hatch, and Eli let himself, for just a moment, be 12 years old instead of the person who just single-handedly saved the atmospheric processor for 6,000 people. The colony's central diagnostic system, Vantik said slowly, once the immediate crisis had visibly settled, has been unable to detect that regulator failure for months. Our engineers, with decades of formal training and equipment I doubt you've ever had access to, spent 2 hours looking in entirely the wrong place. And you diagnosed the actual failure from 3 corridors away, by sound alone, within minutes. I've had a lot of time to listen, Eli said quietly, still a little embarrassed by the attention. That's all it is. I'm not smarter than your engineers. I just know what this place sounds like because I've never had anywhere else to be. Azu, standing nearby, made a sound Eli couldn't quite interpret, something between a scoff and a genuinely startled laugh. That is not nothing, the engineer said. I have spent 30 years being trained to diagnose systems through instrumentation, through protocol, through formal methodology. I do not know how to listen the way you just demonstrated. I am not certain it can be taught, in the way my training was taught. It may simply be something learned through years of necessity that my career never required of me. Necessity your career never required of him, because your species doesn't force 12-year-olds to grow up fixing things nobody else will fix, Nadia said, not quite able to keep the edge out of her voice, even now. Vantik didn't argue the point. He looked instead uncomfortable in a way Eli hadn't expected to see from him, the discomfort of someone confronting an oversight too large to explain away. I have run this station for 11 years, Vantik said slowly. I have filed regular reports on labor allocation, resource distribution, colony productivity. Not once in 11 years have I filed a report asking what skills exist among this colony's population beyond what their assigned designations account for. He looked at Eli for a long moment. That is a significant failure on my part. I do not know how to fully correct it today. But I do not intend to continue making it. The days following the processor repair brought changes slowly, in the careful, bureaucratic way institutional changes tended to arrive. A formal review of colony labor designations, a quietly established maintenance apprenticeship program that, for the first time in the colony's history, allowed human laborers of any age to formally train in technical trades rather than being permanently assigned to menial duty based on arbitrary designations set at birth. Eli didn't ask for any of it. He hadn't wanted the attention, hadn't wanted his careful 2 years of quiet invisibility to end the way it had, in a crowded control room with everyone suddenly looking at him. But Nadia, watching her brother sit through his first formal engineering assessment 3 weeks later, an assessment technician Azu himself insisted on personally administering, muttering something about wanting to properly understand a mind that worked the way Eli's did, thought that maybe some kinds of visibility were worth the discomfort. You did good, she told him, the evening after his assessment, the two of them sitting together in the small quarters they shared with their mother in the lower levels, air circulating clean and steady around them for the first time in longer than either of them wanted to think about. Azu says I test worse than any certified apprentice he's ever assessed, Eli said, a little glumly. Formal theory, written protocols. I don't know any of that stuff. And yet you fixed something in an afternoon that his certified engineers couldn't fix in 2 hours, Nadia said. I don't think that's the kind of thing a written test measures very well. Eli was quiet for a moment, turning a small improvised tool over in his hands, the the same length of shaped wire he'd used to clear the pressure regulator's blockage, worn smooth from years of use. I liked it better when nobody noticed, he admitted quietly. It was simpler. I could just fix things and not worry about anyone expecting anything from me. I know, Nadia said gently, but Eli, you fixed the water reclamation unit 2 years ago. You fixed the heat exchanger and the waste processor and 11 other things nobody else could figure out, all while hiding what you were doing because you were scared of exactly this, scared of people expecting something from you. She reached over, squeezed his shoulder. You're allowed to be good at something without it costing you your whole life. That's not how it has to work. Not anymore, maybe. Eli thought about that for a long time, turning the worn wire tool over and over in his hands, listening to the steady, healthy hum of a processor working exactly as it should, somewhere far above them in the station's core. Maybe, he said finally, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, it didn't feel entirely like a burden to imagine what came next. Overseer Vantik filed his final report on the incident 4 weeks later, a document that would, in time, become the foundation for labor policy reforms across 3 other Krell processing colonies, once word of Havern Station 7's near catastrophe, and its unlikely resolution spread through administrative channels. The report was formal, precise, exactly the kind of document Vantik had filed 1,000 times before in his career. But its final line departed, quietly, from every report he had ever written. This administration's failure was not technical, he wrote. It was a failure of attention. We built systems to measure output, productivity, and designated function, and in doing so, failed for 11 years to notice a child capable of hearing what our most advanced diagnostics could not. I do not know how many other capabilities remain unnoticed within this colony's population, hidden by designations that were never designed to see them. I intend to find out. Eli never read that report. He was, at the time it was filed, 13 corridors away, sitting cross-legged on the floor of a newly designated apprenticeship workshop, disassembling a broken relay unit with technician Azu watching over his shoulder, not with the dismissive skepticism of their first meeting, but with the quiet, attentive patience of someone finally willing to learn something he hadn't known he needed to learn. Tell me what you hear, Azu said, as Eli worked the relay's casing open. Eli listened for a moment, head tilted slightly, the way he always had, long before anyone had thought to ask. It's not broken yet, he said, but it will be in about 2 weeks if nobody checks the coupling. Azu made a note and did not, this time, doubt him at all.